Hello again. My name's Alex. I don't know if you guys know that. So I wanted to make another video today about bolus insulin because the last video I made was about basal insulin, and when you're on a basal bolus insulin regimen, you really need to nail down basal and bolus. So since we covered basal already, time to move on to the stuff that can be a little more complicated. Now, before I get into any details or anything like that, I need to tell you that I am not a medical professional. I have no fancy letters after my name. I cannot give you dosing advice. I can only speak from my personal experience. I've been type 1 diabetic for 27 years, and I've spent the last 4 years studying low carb metabolism and insulin and the human body, following Dr. Bernstein's methods. So I'm not technically qualified to give advice. What I am speaking from here is purely personal experience and theoretical knowledge. So please don't take any of this as gospel. Don't do any major changes based on my suggestion, because that's not why I'm here. What I am here for is to give out information to help you better understand how you can fine-tune your insulin regimen. That's what I'm about. I don't need any legal stuff coming after me. So I'm not a medical professional. Don't take my word as medical advice, please. If you're at all concerned about anything involving your insulin therapy, please talk to your doctor that prescribed it to you. So I just needed to get that out of the way. So when it comes to bolus insulin, there are options. There's only a couple as far as I know. And if there's more out there that I don't mention in this video, I want you to tell me. So the ones that I know about are Humalog and Novolog. They're essentially the same thing. Humalog's made by Eli Lilly, Novolog's made by Novo Nordisk. Two competitive brands, basically the same thing. They have about the same action profile. There's also Apidra, and off the top of my head I can't remember who makes it, but it's either Lilly or Novo Nordisk. And the Apidra is basically the rapid-acting Novolog Humalog with an enzyme added to it that enhances its action profile, and they claim that it starts working faster within about 15 minutes is what they say. I have no personal experience with Apidra. I've never used it. I've been on Humalog for like 25 years now, so I cannot comment on its particulars. But what I'm going to talk about today is how you can figure that out for you if you are taking Apidra. The other bolus insulin that's available that I have no personal experience with that might be an option for you, it's called Afrezza. Afrezza is an inhalable insulin. So instead of, injecting yourself with it, you inhale it like an albuterol inhaler. Supposedly it gets into the bloodstream real quick because it gets dispersed through the capillaries in your lungs, and it's in your system and it works really fast, and then it's out of your system just as fast. That's what they claim. That's what some friends that I have in the diabetes community who use Afrezza have told me about it. But again, I have no personal experience with it, so I cannot comment on that particular medication. The other short-acting insulin that's available that is a little different than the others that I've just mentioned. This one is Humulin or Novolin Regular. And Regular is what was on the market before Humalog and Novolog came out. This was the bolus insulin that they gave us back in the 80s and the 70s and the wee early 90s. Humalog, Novolog came out in like 92, so R was available before all of that. Now, R's got a slightly different action profile, which is part of what we're going to talk about today. So those are, as far as I know, those are the bolus insulins that are available. And they all have different action profiles. They all have different effects within the body. So what I wanted to talk about today was sort of how you can figure out how it works for you, and then use that information to fine-tune your insulin regimen so that you can get flat, tight control. And I would also like to add another little disclaimer here. This is all information that's available in Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes Solution book. If you haven't read it, I would highly suggest you do. But I'm making these videos because I know a lot of people are really visual and they learn by seeing stuff, like what I'm going to draw on this chalkboard. I'm a really visual person, and a lot of times I can read the same paragraph like 10 times and it just in one ear and out the other. So I'm making these videos for people like that who don't quite get from reading what they would otherwise get from someone explaining and drawing it out. So that's why I'm here. So I want to talk about a lot of stuff when it comes to bolus insulin. So this video might be a little longer than my other one, but I think it's important. Okay, so the first thing we should talk about is the timing of your insulin. Actually, no, I take that back. The first thing we're going to talk about is figuring out when you need to correct. So you watched my last video, you did some basal testing, and you figured out where your baseline is. Now, your baseline is high, but you need to figure out how much insulin to give yourself to bring a high blood sugar back down. That's going to be your insulin sensitivity factor. So if you're on a pump, I also wanted to mention, before I talk about timing and correction factors and all that stuff, if you're on a pump, if you're on shots, if you're on a Freza, it does not matter. The theory behind what I'm going to tell you today is all the same. That's something I got as feedback on my last video with the basal rate testing. People were asking me how to do it if you're on a pump. It doesn't matter. Insulin is insulin regardless of how it gets delivered into your body. If you're injecting it versus infusing it with a pump, does not matter. It's going to do the same thing in your body once it gets there. So whatever I'm telling you today, if you're on a pump, great, all of this still applies. Personally, I am on multiple daily injections, also known as MDI. That's just my personal lifestyle choice. So just know, whatever I talk about today applies to pumps and shots. So the timing of your insulin and your correction factor. This is super important because we want to eventually get to the point where we figure out exactly how the insulin works in our system. We know how much it lowers our blood sugar. We know how long it takes to lower our blood sugar and when it's done with its peak action, so that we can avoid stacking doses of insulin on top of one another and causing horrible low blood sugars. So let's talk a little bit about timing. I'm going to use my personal experience as an example. I use Humalog for corrections. I use Novolin regular for mealtime and protein dose bolusing. And I use Tresiba as my basal. And I also sometimes use NPH at night as an intermediary protein bolus insulin, but that's like way more technical than I want to get in this video, and I'm not going to talk about it again. I just wanted to throw it out there. So, okay, Humalog and Novolog, they're about the same. They're just two different manufacturers. So Humalog, they claim it peaks in 15 minutes. That's a bunch of horse crap. And it all depends on the individual, and it all depends on your unique physiology. So I'm going to draw a little bit of a graph here to show you action times and peaks and all that kind of stuff. So here I got an XY axis. This is the time, and this is the peak action of the dose. So let's talk Humalog for a minute. All right, so this is hour 0. This is when you give your injection, right here. Say this is hour 1, this is hour 2, this is hour 3, 4, and 5. In theory, Humalog has an action profile of 5 hours at the most. So what will happen is you give your injection at hour 0, and then it'll start to take action, and it'll start to have worked by hour 1. And then by hour 2, you should see the peak of the action, and between hours 2 and 3 is when the peak action of the dose has taken effect. And then it'll sort of taper off like this. It'll have a little bit of a tail, and then by hour 5, it's completely out of your system. So this is your sweet spot of action on your insulin. This is why patience is a really important thing to have with insulin, because if you think that your insulin is going to work within 15 minutes to an hour, you take it, and at 15 minutes to an hour, your blood sugars only come down 5 points or something like that, and you're trying to correct a high. You're super frustrated, and you give another dose. Well, you just didn't wait long enough. So for me, if my blood sugar is high and I dose and I wait till hour 1, my blood sugar will have come down usually between like 5 to 15 points if it's a moderate high that I'm trying to adjust. If it's a higher high, that sounds funny. If it's a higher high and I have to take a larger dose of insulin, that's going to cause a faster drop down like this. But so by hour 1, I should see a bit of a drop. And then by hour 2, I should see a decent drop. For me, usually by hour 2, if I'm trying to correct a blood sugar of like say 150 back down to 85, by hour 2, my blood sugar should be down to the like 120 to 115 range roughly. And then from there, between hours 2 and 3, when the dose is peaking, I'll see the dramatic drop of like 50 to 60 points down, like that. That's when the action really happens. So you want to wait for that sweet spot on your insulin, because otherwise you could risk severe hypos when you stack doses. That's really bad. Don't do it. So that is Humalog. Starts to peak within an hour. Hours 2 to 3 are where the sweet spot of the action is, and that's when you want to wait for your dose. They claim that Apidra starts a little faster, sort of like this, and so you'll see more of the peak action within an hour, and then between hours 1 and 2 is when they claim Apidra has the bulk of its effect, and then it'll start to taper off like that. So you're talking about the difference between like 30 minutes to an hour. It just depends on you and your physiology and how that insulin works for you. So as with everything diabetes related, when I talk to people about how to adjust their insulin doses, always take notes. Take a lot of notes. Write it down, color code it, use apps, whatever platform you need to. If you have a Dexcom, if you have My Sugar, you can use SugarMate, you can use a notebook, or whatever it is that you use. But just make sure you take a lot of notes, because having this data available allows us to make appropriate dosing decisions. And that's where we end up making informed decisions instead of rage bolusing and ending up super hypo, because we don't like that. So, okay, that's Humalog and Apidra. Those are the, Humalog, Novolog, and Apidra. So those are supposedly the fastest acting insulins available on the market, other than Afrezza. But like I said, I don't have enough experience with Afrezza to be able to discuss it intelligently, so I'm just not going to. Next up is regular insulin, Novolin or Humulin R. This one's a little different. I'm going to write in green. I don't know. Green sounds good. So, R insulin, a little different. It's a milder insulin, milder peak. It has a lower and slower effect as well. So all of these insulins available and the action profiles that they have, they are tools to use in our insulin regimen so that we can fine tune everything. So there is no one is better than the other. There is only what is best for this particular situation. So our insulin starts to take effect within about hour 1, hour 2 really, and then hour 2 it'll kind of peak, and then between hour 3 and 4 is really when you'll see the bulk of that action, and then by hour 5 it'll start to taper off, and then it's got a tail on it the same way the other insulin does of about 8 hours. Obviously, I didn't draw my graph wide enough for you to see that, but I think by hour 5, the effect is negligible, and you can safely avoid stacking a dose if you've gone past 5 hours from injection time. So with R, you want your sweet spot right here from hours 3 to hours 5. And the reason why this is important is because the timing of your dose is really important. When you're trying to adjust your insulin regimen, the amount you take is super important, but when you take it is also important. So, hours 3 to 5. So, the reason that it's important to understand the timing of your dose is to match it up with the timing of the meal and the rise that you see from the meal. So if you're starting completely from scratch, you have never taken insulin before, you don't know what you're doing, or you're starting a brand new insulin and you, again, don't know what you're doing, like say your insurance company just switched you over from Humalog and Lantus to Novolog and Levemir. I don't know, maybe they made a deal with Novo Nordisk, whatever. Anyway, so your insurance just switched you over and now you're up shit creek without a paddle. You've never used these insulins before and you don't know what the hell you're doing. Step 1, do basal testing like you did in the video that I made the other day. Step 2, figure out the timing of your dose. Now, what you want to do is get yourself to a point where you're stable and flat, but a little high. You know, high enough that you would need to correct it. I personally would keep it between the 100 and the 150 range, just because once you get above 150, then your insulin correction factor starts to change, because the higher your blood sugar gets, the more insulin resistant you become. So, you know, say you're floating stable at 130. You want to bring that 130 back down to an 85. So, you can safely guesstimate a dose. Your endocrinologist will give you a correction factor and say, you know, here, try that, play with it, figure it out. So for me, when I'm between 100 and 150, I need 1 unit to bring my blood sugar down 80 points. So if I'm shooting for 85, I need just slightly less than 1 unit to bring myself from 150 down. And that will take about 2 to 3 hours to see the full effect of that dose. So you can do the same. Get your blood sugar slightly elevated, you know, however much you're comfortable with. Take your correction dose. Don't do anything, set a timer, wait 2 to 3 hours, watch your blood sugar. If you've got a CGM, cool, it's super easy to do it with that because you just look at the readout and you watch and you see what your trend is. If you don't have a CGM, like me, you test your blood sugar every 30 minutes or so throughout that time period just to see what happens. You shouldn't see huge changes from one 30-minute increment to the next, and if you do, that means you took a lot. You took too much, because the bigger the dose, the faster the drop. And okay, so timing. Timing's important. So we talked about timing of the short-acting insulin. We talked about timing of the intermediary action. So another thing I wanted to talk about is what's called stacking. I know I've mentioned that a couple of times here. So stacking is when you take more doses in a shorter period of time than you should have. So say you're trying to correct your blood sugar and you took your dose and you gave an injection at hour 0. So you're going to see the action profile like so, like that. But you believe the lies that the drug reps told your endocrinologist, and you think that your insulin should have taken full effect within a first hour. So at hour 1, right here, you rage bolus a little bit because your blood sugar is still high and you're mad that it's still high, and you take more insulin. And then you stack the doses so that at this time frame right here, you have twice as much insulin as you need in your system active at the same time. And that is going to drive your blood sugar super low, and you're going to end up hypo, shaky, incoherent, all kinds of bad stuff, and we don't want that. So don't stack. Be patient. I know that patience is really hard when it comes to correcting a high blood sugar, because you can get mad that it's high, and you can be mad because it's high, because you're cranky and ragey and high blood sugar makes you feel crappy. But please, for your own sake, have some patience and do not stack insulin, because stacking like that is bad. Ask me how I know. All right, so now that we know when insulin does what and how much effect that it has, we talked about our correction factor. All right, now we're going to talk about meal coverage. So for me, when I was figuring out how to fine-tune all my insulin doses and really nail everything, I did some kind of questionable experiments. Enter at your own risk here, okay? This is why I gave you a disclaimer that I'm not a medical professional, and you should not take this advice if you have any questions whatsoever about its safety and efficacy. I'm not about to suggest anything dangerous, but I just need to point that out. So what I did is I ate a meal knowing that my basal rate was set properly. I started that meal at a good number, about 90, flat, stable, ate my meal. And then I didn't bolus at all. And I just sat there and I waited and I watched. And I waited to see how soon my blood sugar started to rise after I ate. And then from the point where it started to rise, how high up did it get? And then once I hit the peak of that rise and it stabled out, how much insulin did it take to bring that rise back down? Now, that gets a little tricky because, like I said, once you get above a certain number, your insulin resistance will go up. But for the most part, in theory, if you eat a meal and you don't bolus for it, and then you wait until your blood sugar shoots up and then you correct it back down, in theory, you should be able to take the dose of the correction that you took as a mealtime pre-bolus and keep your blood sugar flat and stable. So pre-bolus is an important thing, and that's part of what we're going to talk about with meal coverage. And by pre-bolus, I mean when you take your short-acting insulin, how far in advance of that mealtime do you need to take it to get effective coverage of the insulin peak matching the rise from the food? So, say you ate, a salad, and on top of your salad you had some ham. So you should see a bit of a rise from the carbs in your salad. And then a couple of hours after you eat, you should see a rise in blood sugar from the protein. Protein takes a little longer to hit your digestive system and hit your bloodstream than carbohydrate does. So that's why a pre-bolus is important, because you want to have the insulin peaking in your system by the time the carbs hit, so that'll keep a lid on the carbs. And then as it's peaking, the duration of that peak will catch the protein rise. So this is all the ideal theory. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what can go wrong and why it went wrong, and then what you can do about it. So one scenario, say you bolused and you ate whatever it was. Say it was that ham salad. So say hour 0, this is when lunchtime was, and you ate your lunch, and your blood sugar was a nice flat 90 right here coming into that meal time, because you've done basal testing and you got that on point. So say you bolus right when you eat, right before you start eating, you take your dose, and then at about hour 1, your blood sugar starts to dip down like this, and by hour 2 and 3, it's pretty low, and you need to take a glucose correction to bring it back up, because nobody wants to be low, right? So you take your glucose correction after you eat. You got your meal in your belly, but you're low now, so you take your glucose, and then your blood sugar goes back up, and it stays stable. I know this is a little higher than that one, but this is supposed to be, flat and level. So say you got a postprandial dip like this. You ate glucose and your blood sugar came back up to the preprandial number and it stayed flat. This pattern means that your dose is high, but your timing is good. I'm going to say that again. So if you ate, you were stable before you ate, you drop low after you eat, and you take a glucose correction, and you come back up, and then you stable after you come back up, your dose is high, but your timing is good. Now, let's say that you ate. Same scenario, same meal, same timing, same bolus. Let's say you ate and you dropped down low, and then you gave a glucose correction, but then you went way high afterwards like that. This means that your dose is good and your timing, oh wait, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, sorry. Your dose is good and your timing is off. All right, so remember how we talked about the peak of your insulin? You want to match the peak of your insulin with the rise from your food. So this means that the peak of your insulin was here and the rise from your insulin, or rise from your food, was there. So what we want to do is take the peak of your insulin and shift it over here so that it matches up with the rise from your food. So for me, that means that I need to delay my bolus after I eat. Your mileage may vary. Everybody is different. This is why I say take copious notes, because your individual experience with insulin and food will be different from mine. I also have a different bolus strategy for every meal that I eat and what time of day that I eat it at, because it has a significant effect on how my digestion functions, whether I eat it during the daytime or whether I eat it at night at dinner. Again, your mileage may vary. So, if you drop low after, you take a glucose correction, and you go high after the glucose, your dose is good, but your timing is off. On the flip side, if you eat your meal, you're stable and flat, same meal, ham salad, right? Stable and flat. If after your meal, your blood sugar goes up like this, and then it comes back down to a stable level, that means that your dose is right, but your timing is off in the other direction. So if your dose is right, but your timing is off and your blood sugar does that, you need to shift this dose that way. If in time, you need to shift it in time that way. If your dose is off and your time, or if your dose is right but your timing is off and you go high, you need to pre-bolus more. Make sense? I always say that you have insulin in one hand and glucose in the other. They're basically counterweights for each other. So if you see inverse patterns in your blood sugars, it's basically, substitute insulin for glucose in the solution. I hope that makes sense. That might be a little technical. So if you eat and your blood sugar goes high after you eat and then it stays high like that, that means that your dose was too low. You need to take more insulin. So, a couple of scenarios that are possible for how to troubleshoot what scenario is going on. And it's somewhat tricky to identify dose versus timing, so that's why it's important to recognize patterns. That's why I point out these patterns, because that will help you overall. It will help you go back and look at your blood glucose data and see certain patterns. If you eat the same lunch every day and you consistently have the same blood sugar pattern every day after lunch, then you need to adjust your bolus regimen, either dose or timing, it depends. So, if after lunch, every single day, an hour after you eat, your blood sugar goes up, and then all afternoon, you're super high, you need to give yourself more insulin. If your blood sugar goes up and then it comes back down, even though you didn't give a correction right here, you need to take more of a pre-bolus. So maybe give yourself insulin 15 minutes before you eat instead of right when you eat. Sort of depends on the timing. So knowing the action timing of your insulin versus the rise in your blood sugar after you eat is how you line those two up and you get stable flat blood sugars. I hope that makes sense. So, to recap, there's a couple of different types of bolus insulin. They don't all work the same, and they don't all work the same for every person. So you're going to need to figure out how your body responds to things. You need to figure out your particular insulin sensitivity factor, which is how much insulin does it take to drop my blood sugar and by how many points. I also have varying insulin sensitivity factors depending on what time of day it is. So first thing in the morning, I'm super insulin resistant. It takes me 1 unit to drop 30 points first thing in the morning until 11 o'clock-ish. That's about when the resistance from the morning time hormones drops off. In the afternoon and early evening, it takes 1 unit to drop me 80 points. So that's like 2.5 times more insulin sensitivity in the afternoon than I have in the morning. Again, your mileage may vary. Everybody's different. So figure out your correction factor. You also need to figure out the timing of your insulin in your personal physiology. I gave you some gists of the action profiles of the insulin, and you can sort of fine-tune how the profile works for you from there. Another important thing that helps me when I'm trying to figure out stuff and I'm trying to troubleshoot is the package insert on your insulin. That wad of paper that's shoved down in the box or the carton with your insulin vials and pens, it's not there for no reason. It's crammed full of all kinds of information. It'll talk about the action profile, it'll talk about the timing, it'll talk about the duration, it'll talk about what kind of results they got from their clinical trials and what kind of people they used in their clinical trials, all kinds of good stuff. I know it's kind of technical, but it's really invaluable information for when you're trying to understand how your insulin works. I also understand that all of this can be a lot and it can be daunting. So, learn as much as you can as you're comfortable with and apply as necessary. You don't need to understand the theory behind why it works if you know that it works and that you can duplicate your results. That's all that really matters. We're looking for stable blood sugar. You don't need to understand why your blood sugar is stable in order to achieve stability. So I hope that nobody gets scared away by all of that. So yeah, I think that it's doable to figure these things out. It's going to take a lot of hard work for a couple of weeks, and then less hard work for the rest of the time. But just take a lot of notes, use your apps, use your CGM, use your notebook, color code stuff, whatever you got to do that works with your brain and how you work. Take all these notes and then go back and look at your notes. If you're going to eat the same meal on Monday that you ate last Wednesday, go back and look at your log from last Wednesday and see what happened. If on last Wednesday you ate that meal and you dropped low afterwards and then you came back up and you were high all afternoon, you know that you need to take a different approach. It's all about pattern recognition. It's all about recognizing how you respond to things. So I hope you can take all of this information and help fine-tune your dose. Start with basal testing, get that knocked out, get that sort of flat and stable and, you know, eliminate that variable out of the equation, then you can start mucking around with your short acting and your correction doses and your mealtime coverage. I hope this helps you. I would love some feedback on this video. I know I kind of ramble a little bit sometimes, but it's because this is such a near and dear subject to my heart, because I've been diabetic my entire life, and I just want everybody to have happy, stable blood sugars and just, you know, be well as a diabetic. It is possible. I hope you can achieve that. I hope that I can help you achieve that. So let me know what you think of this video. Give me some feedback. I'll be back with more videos later. Thanks. Bye.